You have mentioned you're sharing some women figures or melodramas seem to be recurring themes in your works, and they have embodied alternate aspects of inner and social life unexplored in most Asian contexts. And also they seem to appear together on multiple occasions. I think this remains quite consistent from your earliest films and to your latest one, the Juma. Could you explain more about this preference and pairing? And also beyond this question, I think as I was going through your presentation today, some new observations sort of stand out here is like all this kind of melodramas, they're like old time. I think this is a part of the memory a lot of our audience generation we all grew up with. And for me, this is sort of nostalgia for the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's also a very interesting kitschness. There's a sort of a kitsch quality to it. And with this kitschness, I feel like in some way, it gives the characters and identities a sort of playfulness to move around in your plot. And another thing is that in a lot of books, they will try to put movie and soap opera or melodramas as two kind of oppositional mediums. But in your films, I see they're like rotating together, and also in Ajuma as well. And I see tension between the two mediums gives your films a different quality here. And also in some way, this kind of a drama inside drama, this kind of quality is something I'm really interested in. And I hope you can explain more about that.
I would go back to my own personal connection as a storyteller first. I think part of it is I grew up with a family where it's very matriarchal. So the women in my family were the first instances of storytellers for me, whether it is recounting something that has happened in the neighborhood, or whether it's something that happened in the family, whether it's gossip, whether it's telling us children about our family history. I think the act of storytelling came from these women, came from the mother. So I think sometimes that tend to also have this larger than life quality to the storytelling. So melodrama for me has always been that kind of so much more larger than life, it's almost unreal. But I think it has sort of become my approach towards comedy or irony. I think for some reason, sometimes melodrama is seen as this very silly genre. So if you look at someone like Douglas Sirk, the American film director, who is a perfect example of a melodrama master, anyone who does melodrama, you hate his film, but you also love them. I think whatever the motive, whatever the theme that were used, I love those works. But deep in my heart, I do think it's silly, the kitschness and all that. If you look at some of these works objectively, I think it presents something that audience can identify with. It's almost something quite important. And I think melodrama is also this very shifting genre where you can either sort of squeeze your heart with the drama or you can laugh yourself off. I think there's a space of balance between tragedy and comedy. So melodrama is something that is in between. I think this ambiguity offers this vast amount of crankiness. There's an in-between of melodrama that I'm quite fond of because I think it offers this margin for perspective. It is the foolishness of melodrama, the kitschness, but it also becomes this actual seriousness that enables the filmmaker to sort of grasp this essence of time. You can feel the sadness of the tragedy, but you can also cherish the laughter. I think sometimes that's how we perceive the reality of ours. That's how I feel it. We live seriously, I think. But then again, we also do foolish things. I think this is how we live our life, and this is the reason sometimes I respond so well to melodrama, because life is melodramatic.
I totally agree. And another thing I noticed about your film is that sometimes when I watching some of the plots, I cannot expect what the next plot might be. Is it going to be comedy or is it going to be tragedy? So I think that's always a coexistence of comedy and also some kind of depth and seriousness coexisting in a lot of your films. And another thing is that melodrama in your films is also a very good aesthetic device in some way. You can also see it as a mirror some way, because I see most of the film you have like three spaces, right? You have one space inside a melodrama, and you have one space that's outside of melodrama. That's the watcher, La Bella, the Vietnamese girl, and also the space of the director, that's the third eye. I think the three spaces sort of showcase some kind of tension between each other. So I think that's something I also noticed really powerful about this melodrama usage in your film. The second question is that I've noticed that many of your characters seem to be searching for a home, or at least a symbolic one, throughout the stories. Also, going back to our topic, diaspora, I'm referencing here the British scholar Stuart Hall, who tends to summarize the state as one of becoming but not being. So this idea of diaspora here also extends beyond the narrow meaning of being geographically or culturally away from the motherland, as I see in Letters from the Motherland, but sort of carries out a state of uncertainty and fluidity, and sometimes a state of playfulness, as I see in Owen and Rumland. So for different subjects, I feel like home and diaspora sort of become a memoryscape that is like non-linear or sometimes even anti-linear. So would you be able to explain more about this sort of extended idea of diaspora and how it connects with your identity as a Hainanese Singaporean artist now based in California and Singapore?
I think there is a certain desire in a lot of us to want to seek home, especially when we sort of move around. And it almost feels like the becoming never seemed to end. For example, I see my father who came to Singapore from Hainan as a child at 6. It wasn't something that he chose to do at 6. It was his father that wanted to come here to work and brought the family along. So moving here was in mid-50s, and then having to learn Malay, English, and Chinese. So he came at a time when Singapore was going in between post-war. So he lived through that era. In the 60s, Singapore was independent in 1965. So my father is fully Singaporean, but he's also very, very connected to his family back in Shanghai, in Hainan. And I remember this, I think growing up, my grandmother spoke only Hainanese. So as a child, I remember hearing the dialect. There's almost this rejection and this resentment of that dialect. Where it's like, oh, it just sounds so crude. It's just so loud. And as a child, I just kind of rejected it for a long time. I think growing up, I see my father's connection to the language, to not just saying it, speaking the dialect, but also just sort of writing it. When I worked on Letters from the Motherland, when we have to go through these letters, that it's not like these days when we try to write an email. I mean, you drop a text and then you send it out. Back then, before the internet, it was him writing it on paper, a few drafts, rewriting it, and then finally like, okay, this is the letter I'm going to send to Shanghai, and then I'll wait for a few weeks before it comes back. So the act of that kind of exchange for me, that I was sort of become this memory for me growing up. When I revisited this in 2016, working on this film together with my father, I understood that one thing, for at least my father, growing up in Singapore, there is still that home that I grew up for 6 years, but the connection is still there. It has never left. I think it has always been a big part of him. He is retired now, but he is very involved with Hainanese clans in Singapore, where he loves Hainanese opera, which I didn't even know was a thing. I grew up hearing, oh, there is Teochew, Chaozhou opera, or different dialects, but Hainanese opera is quite a niche in terms of dialect opera. But he would work with this clan when they bring in troops from Hainan to Singapore to perform. So he was very involved in wanting to bring a kind of culture that is very specific to where he's from to Singapore, and connecting with people in Singapore who has connection to his hometown. So there is that connection he's creating for himself at his stage in his life right now. He's very active in it. Like, this is me understanding that as a son. But then when I moved to LA on my own, once the dust sort of settles, where I'm like, oh, wow, California, everything you want to explore. But then there's a part of you that sort of misses home, and you grasp onto the memories of things that is very sensory, in the sense of like, oh, the humidity, the food, or even just the accent of the people that you somehow meet, and you go like, oh my God, are you from Singapore? So there is that connection of, I don't feel like I have to want to belong, because I truly believe a home is what you make of. In the act of becoming, you can't fully love something 100%. Love comes with a lot of, I wouldn't say hate, but just things that you don't like. So you have to embrace the things you don't like. There are a lot of things about Singapore that I don't enjoy. And there are also a lot of things in California and the US that I just don't understand culturally or whatever. but that's home,
Yeah,
That
as I see in your Letters from the Motherland, the comparison of two landscapes, of course, they are tropical islands. I think there's a very interesting difference between the two, as you show the images of, kids,
Mhm.
playing and firing the fireworks for Spring Festival and all that. Where in Singapore, everything was more in a very rigid order and stuff like that. But they're all connected by the Hainanese dialect. And I
Yeah,
think it's interesting you mentioned you always thought Hainanese was a crude language, right?
it really made me working on it, having spent such a part of my life as a child, sort of rejecting it, whether it's being rebellious or just accepting a different culture. But I think growing up, especially when I was working on it and having to read and translate, and I remember learning about the dialect becomes a language class for me where I'm reading the letters and thinking it's written in Mandarin, but I was like, no, it's written in Hainanese. So even the words are different. It become almost sort of like understanding how beautiful the language is. The perspective changes. You kind of understand why my father is so. It's just not because it's home, but also because it is very different for him, the language. And it is just so much of that language that I'm fascinated with as an adult.
Also, I feel this kind of Hainanese identity is also, say, the becoming for you as well, some
Hmm.
kind of identity for you to wear as a hat or learn to wear as a hat. I feel that's something a lot of artists also try to own as part of their identity, but also there's a bit of a
Yeah.
tension in there. And I think another thing is interesting about Letters from Motherland is that for the most part of the film, you're like behind the camera, you're always the hidden
Watching.
artist, right? Yeah, you're always watching, you're always acting almost as someone that's like always objectively watching what's going on between your father and his hometown. And you also remains this distance from what's going on in there. But only in the last shot of the film you appeared as part of the family portrait. I think that's something is sort of journey of becoming for you as well.